What family secret shocked you to the core? Story 1. My uncle got kicked out of my grandparents' house after he got a DUI. After that, he got 2 more DUIs and went to jail after he was caught dealing illegal substances. My granddad, who was a district attorney, called in a favor and got him off the hook, with the understanding that my uncle would never contact anyone in our family again. My uncle then got a job driving a beverage delivery truck around, stocking gas stations and vending machines. Later, he started working for the utilities department in a small town near our family. After saving money for 10 years, he asked my mom if he could build us a house. This was the first contact he had with our family in over a decade. He hired his own crew, bought his own materials, the whole 9 yards, free of charge for my parents. The house he built was so nice that other people started asking him to build theirs too. Soon he started his own company and is now the owner of the largest residential construction company in 2 major cities. It was shocking for me because growing up, he was always so kind and got along great with everyone. You would have never guessed what his past was. Story 2. My mom was adopted as a child. She knew her whole life that she was adopted, but she knew nothing about her birth family except that her parents had her when they were teenagers, and they placed her for adoption because they weren't married. She was born in 1963, for context. But about 3 years ago, she was contacted by her birth parents. Apparently, they stayed together, eventually got married, and had 2 sons. Neither of the sons knew about my mom until 3 years ago, when her birth parents told them. It turned out to be a heartwarming family secret. My mom is now very close with her birth parents and her biological brothers, and my extended family on that side was very welcoming. Also, here are just some fun facts. My mom grew up literally 5 minutes away from her biological family. She went to the same schools as her biological brothers, although they never met, as she is 5 years older than them. My mom's ex-husband, my dad, was lab partners with one of her biological brothers in high school, and my mom's adoptive brother's wife used to babysit the biological brothers. Story 3. I got pregnant while unmarried at 22 years old. My mom was worried that my grandparents, while very accepting on the surface, might silently judge the situation, and she shared this concern with her father. He then revealed to her that back in 1959, he met my grandmother and she became pregnant before they were married. He went off to basic training in another state, promising to come back and marry her. No one thought he would, but he did. She had been sent to a home for unmarried women, and he found her, married her, and they went on to have 4 more children. My mom is the oldest. They kept this a secret from all the children. The older generation knew, but by the time he revealed it to my mom, most of them had passed away. It's kind of romantic. Story 4. Long story short, my grandma and great-aunt hid the fact that my great-aunt's husband not only harmed and impregnated his own daughter, but also abused her daughter, his granddaughter, the child she had after giving birth to his child. When he was caught abusing the granddaughter, her mother tried to stop him, possibly pressing charges, and he and my great-aunt left their home state and moved to the state where we are. My grandma knew, but kept it a secret until one day she saw him paying too much attention to me when I was 8 years old. He and my great-aunt went to church with us, and we had lots of family gatherings. The next day, my grandma questioned me privately to see if he had done anything to me. Then she took me home to my parents and finally told them he had been living nearby for months because of what he did to his granddaughter. I was sent to my room, and years later, my parents told me they were furious. They were disgusted and outraged that she had hidden something so serious and put me at potential risk. They told me the whole truth about 10 years later. About 25 years later, I work as an advocate for families and children. I think of my cousin, his granddaughter, and his daughter every day. I have a photo of them together. I look at it to remind myself to fight with all my strength against hidden family abuse, to do everything I can to protect the kids I serve. Both of them have lived difficult lives shaped by what he did. I take every ounce of anger I feel for him and use it to help children who are hurt by people like him. It might sound dramatic, but his granddaughter is my age. Comparing our lives, knowing what she could have become if she'd been protected, it's just heartbreaking. Story 5. After I became an adult, my uncle, my mom's brother, and aunt divorced. I asked my mom why she thought it happened after about 25 years of marriage, and she nonchalantly, not heartlessly, just matter-of-factly, since I was now an adult, and apparently it was fine to tell me things like this. told me all about how my aunt had been deeply affected by trauma. Her father had abused both her and her sister when they were children, and she had struggled with bulimia, used laxatives, and alcoholism. Apparently, my uncle was also, and still is, a heavy drinker, though he's a more jovial type. She always seemed very normal to me, except that she was kind of strict. She always made her son and us cousins take our shoes off in the house, and we had to eat every bit of food on our plates. That felt strict to me because our house was always messy, and we rarely finished what was on our plates. A few years ago, she attempted to take her life in a very violent way. She survived but was left severely disfigured. I just saw her this weekend at her granddaughter's birthday party. When my mom first told me all of this, I remember saying, "Wow, I guess I get to hear all the things I was sheltered from as a kid." My mom replied, "Welcome to adulthood." Story 6. My aunt cut off communication with our family after my grandparents passed away. She had been their caretaker, and after they were gone, she just disappeared from our lives. About a year or so later, my dad got a call from the Florida Police Department saying he needed to come identify her body. From what we were able to piece together through people she had known, we believed she had cancer. But when my dad and sister went down there, they were told she had taken her own life in a hotel room by drinking antifreeze. She never had cancer. After she stopped speaking to our family, she took whatever money was left from my grandparents and traveled the world. When the money ran out, she ended her life. As we continued to dig into what happened, we made contact with some of the friends she had met on her travels. All of them, including a nurse, were convinced that she had been seriously ill. It turns out she had fabricated everything. She was just a pathological liar. Story 7. Looking back, my family had so many secrets that shocked me when I first learned them, but now they've become just another part of the background. Two of my aunts struggled with teen pregnancies. One aunt had 2 abortions due to unwanted pregnancies as a teenager. When she tried to get a third, the doctor refused, and she ended up going through with the pregnancy. The baby was put up for adoption. Another aunt also had 2 unwanted pregnancies during her teen years. She gave the first baby up for adoption and tried to raise the second child for about 6 months before realizing she couldn't do it. Since my grandparents worked as farmhands and frequently moved to follow jobs, it was eventually agreed that my grandmother would take in the baby. That child was then raised as my uncle instead of my cousin. Everyone in the family now knows the truth, but we still treat him as an uncle because that's what he prefers and what we grew up with. Also, 2 of my great uncles ended up marrying the same woman. During her first marriage to one of them, she started having an affair with his brother. Eventually, she left the first uncle and ran off with the second, and they stayed married for the rest of their lives. But the 2 brothers never spoke again. Story 8. My grandmother did not die 10 years ago. She had actually been placed in a mental institution on the other side of town for the past 50 years. But now she's passed away. One day, my parents sat me down and said that my grandmother, on my father's side, had just died. As far as the whole family knew, she had passed away at least a decade earlier. But no, she had been institutionalized since 1940, and only now had she passed. My mom and dad were going to attend the funeral and said they'd be back by supper time. Nothing to see here. I never met her and only ever saw one photo of her, a wedding picture. I knew my grandfather had gotten divorced in the 1930s and that my dad lived with my aunt in the same city. There were allegations that my grandfather had been abusive and violent, which is why my dad lived with his aunt instead. There were also rumors that my grandmother wasn't mentally ill at all, but had fought back against his abuse, and that he had her committed so he could get out of the marriage. The other secret they told me 2 years later. My sister had an unplanned pregnancy during college. She has a daughter who is now grown up, and they've reconnected. So my parents have actually been grandparents since 1975, but never mentioned it. I also had a niece I didn't know about, who lived in the same city and is nearly my age. Story 9. My aunt isn't the only wife. She is so kind that she actually allowed her husband to marry another woman. However, he now uses her for food and shelter. But whenever he travels, he always takes the second wife with him. I later found out that when he wanted to marry the second woman, my aunt said he'd have to divorce her first. They went to court, and the husband said he would only agree to divorce if she didn't try to claim any property or assets. She disagreed. Then he allegedly bribed someone. They went back to court, and suddenly he became the victim and refused to divorce her. She was forced to remain married and watch him marry someone else. She even helps care for the second wife's child and makes pastries for everyone. It makes me incredibly upset, but she gave up fighting a long time ago. Now whenever he visits her house, it's more of a burden. He expects his clothes washed and ironed, uses the only automatic car that was meant for her and their children, and constantly demands home-cooked meals. He verbally mistreats her. Her eldest son won't even eat dinner with them because he can't stand how his dad treats his mom. He tries hard to protect her. The only reason this man is still considered useful is because he sometimes gives money for his children's education, though even that comes with control. For example, the eldest son wanted to study business, but the father forced him into engineering. He also provides grocery money, but my aunt has to ask for it and endure his verbal mistreatment. She's unfit to work, but still so kind. She makes amazing pastries and cakes, yet if someone asks for one, she'll do it for free, even though she doesn't have the money. I'm honestly angry just writing about this. It might not be a secret, but it's definitely something the family tried to keep quiet. Storytime. I had a great uncle on my mom's side who was a Catholic priest. I always thought he was just a nice elderly man. He never did or said anything that made me suspicious. I saw him at many family gatherings over the years. But when he died, my dad told my brothers and me that he had been involved in serious crimes. He had numerous victims and was involved in deeply disturbing behavior. When the police searched his home, they found a trunk full of illegal and disturbing material, much of which he had created himself. One of his victims was so psychologically affected that he was considered unfit to testify in court. The most unbelievable part? He was simply relocated to a different diocese in San Diego after everything came to light. My mother's family never talks about it. In fact, some of them were upset with my dad for being so open about how horrible it all was. Also, when I was a child, my mom once told me, while intoxicated, that she had experienced multiple miscarriages before she had my brothers and me. Not incredibly shocking, but it's the kind of thing that makes you realize your parents had entire lives and stories before you were ever born. Things you may never fully know. Story 11. My mother experienced multiple traumatic events during her pregnancies. We only recently learned that she had a child who passed away during delivery. Apparently, there were no warning signs beforehand. When she went into labor, she believed she'd be coming home with a baby. It was her first child, but she never spoke about it to any of us. We found out when my sister attended a cousin's baby shower, and someone asked why my mom wasn't there. My aunt explained the story and said that my mom never attends baby showers until after the baby's actually born. My sister was completely shocked, and my aunt added, "I can't believe you didn't know. I probably shouldn't have told you." During her next pregnancy, my mother's husband was murdered 2 or 3 weeks before my brother was born. This is another story she never talks about. All we've ever been told is that he died. We're too afraid to ask for more details because it's clearly painful for her. She also had a miscarriage between my birth and my sister's. Right before my sister was born, our oldest cousin, who was the first child on my mom's side, was involved in a car accident that turned fatal. She was in a coma for a while before passing. During my sister's birth, the umbilical cord was wrapped around her neck, and she nearly died. My mother often says that she loves being a mom, but she hates being pregnant, because all the worst things in her life happened while she was expecting. Story 12. A little late to this one, but I had to share. My stepdad has been in my life since an early age. He and mom got married when I was 7, and we always heard his stories about growing up. He loved to tell us about his summers at their cabin in the mountains and the fun times he had with friends. We always heard about his older sister, but one day he mentioned a brother we never knew existed. After much prying by my sister and me, we learned that this brother, I'll call him Steve, had been estranged from the family after becoming pagan. Years later, Uncle Steve even reached out to my stepdad and told him he lived not far from us. Steve always sent us a Christmas card with a yearly family update, though he referred to it as a Yule letter, telling us about his volunteer work after Hurricane Katrina and the adventures he, his wife, and daughter would take. It all sounded very familiar to our own family, and we always enjoyed reading them. As I got older and my parents became more open-minded, we even talked about visiting Steve next time we were in his town. Here's where it gets strange. One morning we were woken up by a phone call. I remember it was very early, maybe 6 in the morning, and I jumped out of bed to get it. My stepdad answered from their room before I could reach it, So I went on with my morning routine of letting the dog out and pouring a bowl of cereal. Eventually, he came downstairs with a very puzzled look on his face. He told me that it had been the police from a small coastal town about 4 hours away. They had asked if Steve was his brother, then informed him that Steve's body had washed ashore that morning. They didn't know who to contact and needed to start an investigation. My stepdad admitted he hadn't spoken to Steve in quite some time and gave them a number to reach his family. Before ending the call, the police asked if they could keep his number on file for further questioning, as they suspected foul play might be involved. We never heard anything else about Uncle Steve after that day. He was gone, and his family was never heard from again. Sometimes I still wonder what really happened. Story 13. When I was hanging out with my younger brother, he was 14 at the time, I was 24, he said something along the lines of, I think I look more like mom's friend so-and-so than I look like dad. After years of quietly wondering the same thing, I had to admit he was right. He was starting to look a lot like so-and-so and not much like our naturally heavier set father. So I said to him, I don't know, buddy. Things were complicated back then. You might be surprised if you look into it. A few months later, I was sitting in a 24-hour diner when so-and-so walked in. He saw me and decided to sit at my table. After a few pleasantries, I just had to ask. And he admitted to a 20-year affair with my mom, and even said he had secretly taken some of my brother's hair and sent it in for a mail-away DNA test, which came back positive. He went on about how he wanted to come clean and spend time with my brother, but didn't want to deal with my mom anymore, since things had ended badly. I told him that my brother was usually home alone for a few hours after school every day, and would love some company, especially since our dad had moved 1,400 miles away. So-and-so stammered and made a bunch of excuses. I stood up, told him off, asked him to pay for my cheeseburger, and left. My brother figured it out on his own and was never able to build a relationship with him. Later, he resented him even more when so-and-so started a new family, making my brother feel abandoned. Our mom is great, and we don't bring up the past. We all understand that love can be complicated. Story 14. My mother struggles with severe mental health issues. For years, I believed many of the things she said, only realizing in my teens that a lot of what she said simply wasn't grounded in reality. Her claims weren't completely impossible, just highly implausible. For example, she once said her landlord had two of her neighbors harmed to score political points. Political points with whom? She never explained specifics, just vaguely references a shadowy international organization that supposedly controls everything, from U.S. politics to the healthcare companies she works for. According to her, their main goals are distributing illegal substances and promoting dark ideologies. Anyone who enters her life, any strange event in her neighborhood, or even news reports get woven into her story, usually as part of a supposed enemy plot. Over the past 15 years, she's decided nearly everyone she or I interact with regularly is part of this group. Friends from school, their families, her co-workers, her siblings, and even the former president of the United States. She watches a lot of certain news channels which didn't cause her behavior, but certainly intensified it. Coming to this realization reshaped my understanding of people. I don't take what anyone says at face value anymore. I find myself analyzing people's statements for signs of delusion. I now believe that many people are deeply misinformed, some to the point where their thinking becomes dysfunctional. I think a disturbingly large portion of people over 50, maybe around 40%, seem mentally intact on the surface but harbor irrational beliefs that shape their worldview in alarming ways. Story 15. My wife's grandfather was Italian and living in Italy at age 20 during World War II. I asked what he did during the war and got no answers. I asked my wife's mom, his daughter, and she claimed he was studying at a university in Italy for the entire war. I didn't believe it. Everyone in the family was upset with me for pressing the issue, but I stood my ground. There was no way a male of that age wasn't involved in some capacity. Eventually, my wife's mom called an aunt, his sister, still living in Italy. She explained that during the war, the oldest brother in the family was drafted. Their father and he ran the family farm in Modena, and they couldn't maintain it without the eldest son. So my wife's grandfather, who was about 17 at the time, assumed his brother's identity and took his place in the draft. He went to war. He survived. He became a scientist and helped develop a famous plastic, polypropylene, possibly. Later, he immigrated to the U.S., lived a good life, and passed away a few years ago. I attended his funeral and heard all kinds of stories about him. But my wife, her mother, her sister, and her aunt had never heard any of this. They had no idea. For all we know, they buried a war hero. They don't know what he did during the war. Was he a spy? A soldier? A scientist? No one in the family seems interested in finding out more. Story 16. When I was in college, I Googled my last name and found some public records from a lawsuit. Extremely curious, I read through an outline written by the state of Connecticut regarding a workers' compensation case my grandmother had filed against the state. Apparently, my grandfather, a police officer, had been involved in an on-duty incident that she claimed triggered a heart attack. She sued the state, saying the aftermath of the heart attack led him into depression, which eventually ended in suicide. The details about his behavior and death were absolutely shocking. I had only known my grandfather as a kind, gentle old man who would visit Florida a few months out of the year, and who I was told had passed from another heart attack. But it turns out my parents lied to me. They didn't think I could handle the truth, that he had taken his own life after years of insomnia, depression, and abusive behavior toward nearly everyone around him. Story 17. I grew up thinking my great-grandma was born and raised in Mexico. During my sophomore year of high school, I had an assignment to interview a family member about their experience during a historical event. I chose my great-grandma, who was 90 at the time. I figured she had lived through a lot. When I asked her what historical event she wanted to talk about, she picked the Great Depression. She told me that her parents had come to California from Chihuahua, Mexico before she was born, so she was actually an American citizen by birth. But during the Great Depression, Americans began to blame the financial crisis on Mexican immigrants. The Hoover administration was under pressure and wanted to make it seem like they were doing something to improve the economy. Her family was offered a small sum of money to be deported to Mexico, even though they were citizens, losing their legal status. She cried, telling me that if this hadn't happened, her life could have been so much better. She never learned to speak English, even though she was born in California. She passed away at 94, 2 months ago. While going through her things, my family and I found a beginner's English book in her bedroom. Story 18. When I was little, from the day I was born until I was about 5, my uncle, my mom's brother, lived with us. He was our live-in babysitter. He made pancakes for my sister and me every weekend, introduced me to ramen noodles, and clearly loved us both very much. My dad didn't like him, and they argued constantly. I couldn't understand why. My uncle made us pancakes every weekend. As I got older, I kind of forgot he had ever lived with us. No one ever really talked about it. Now I'm 19. My uncle has his own place, a good job, and still visits our house nearly every weekend to make pancakes and hang out. He's the only uncle who remembers my birthday every single year. After one of my early days in high school, he gave me a talk about avoiding drugs and how they can mess you up. It wasn't anything new. I'd already heard it in health class, so I didn't think much of it. I later mentioned the conversation to my mom, and she suddenly went silent and looked very nervous. She told me that before I was born, my uncle had struggled with serious drug addiction and had nearly overdosed. She didn't specify on what. He had been homeless, jobless, dealing with alcoholism, and in a terrible place. My mom, out of 7 siblings, was the only one who offered him help. That's why he came to live with us. My dad didn't want a person struggling with addiction near his newborn children and threatened to kick him out if anything happened to us. My mom said that my uncle got clean and stayed clean because of my sister and me. We are the reason he's still alive. That shook me to the core. Knowing that I helped save someone's life before I could even walk or talk, it changed the way I saw everything. Story 19. My grandfather, American, owned an international agricultural business in the 1960s and 1970s, with offices in Romania and Hungary. He traveled frequently between the U.S. and Eastern Europe for business purposes. Because of the nature of his work, he regularly met with government officials and business people in the countries he visited. After he passed away, we were cleaning out his house and found 2 passports from that time period. Both had his photo, but only one contained his real information. The other had a different name, social security number, and so on. They both looked completely legitimate and had identical stamps, but with different dates that never overlapped. It looked like he used one passport for one trip and the other for the next. My dad and uncles remembered men in suits occasionally showing up at the farm. Whenever that happened, my grandfather would send all the kids out to the barn until the guests were gone. Apparently, none of them ever questioned him about it. He sold the business in the late 70s. I was completely shocked to discover that my mild-mannered cowboy grandfather may have been involved in something secretive. I'm frustrated I never got to ask him about it. Story 20. My grandfather didn't have any sons, but I was the first grandson. I look like him, and I've been told all my life that I act like he did at my age. When I turned 13, he decided I was man enough to start passing down some of his knowledge. He sat me down and gave me advice about what it means to be a man and how to carry yourself with honor. Then he began telling me a little about his time in Vietnam. Over the next 3 years, he told me everything. I'm the only one who knows the full story. It was surprising to hear those things from a man who was always tough, but loving and fair. When I joined the army, he reminded me of all the things he had done, not to glorify them, but so I could learn from them and do better. Now that I'm older, I look into his eyes and see the man I could have become had he not given me that guidance. I hope I can carry those lessons with me when my time comes. Until then, I carry a generation's worth of secrets. Story 21. When I was about 5 or 6, I became friends with two brothers who lived nearby. We quickly became inseparable, and our parents started arranging play dates almost daily. The brothers were wild and always into mischief. I remember once, we stood near the road and sprayed passing drivers in the face with water guns through their open windows. One day, things went too far. We completely trashed my house. We broke my mom's antique chair, and I vividly remember dumping a box of cereal all over the stairs. The strange part is that I was the one who led the chaos. Usually, I was the timid one who followed along. I was terrified of my parents and never acted out. I also remember wondering why my dad, who was supposed to be watching us, wasn't around that day. Years later, my mom casually dropped the bomb that my dad had been secretly involved with the brother's mother, and that's why we had been unsupervised. She said it like I should have known already, and part of me thinks I did. Looking back, I think I trashed the house as a subconscious rebellion against my dad's betrayal. That event even led to my mom discovering the affair. My parents didn't get divorced until I was a senior in high school. Story 22. Nothing in my family shocked me to the core, mostly because both sides are full of terrible things. My mom was adopted after her biological mom ran off and her dad passed away. Her adopted brother and his biological brother both abused her when they were kids. Despite that, my grandmother always treated the abusive brother as her favorite child because he was her youngest after her oldest son died. Her irrational attachment to him lasted through his adult life, including when he moved back home at around 60 years old and nearly caused her death through neglect. She was eventually placed in assisted living for dementia. When my dad found out about the abuse, he started treating my mom terribly. He became emotionally abusive and started cheating on her. She was about to leave him but found out she was pregnant with me, so she stayed. My dad's brother murdered his estranged girlfriend, who was also the mother of two of his kids, because he believed she was going to seek child support. She wasn't. It was actually the second girlfriend he had killed. For the first one, he had received a lenient sentence because my grandfather knew the judge. That case involved him using a firearm in front of her family. My dad was forced to testify against his brother in court because his brother had come to my parents' house, while my mom was pregnant with me right after the murder. He later threatened to kill both of them if he ever got out, which he won't. The trial also caused my parents to lose almost all of their friends. They got married shortly after that, mostly to appease my dad's family during the fallout. My mom's side has always hated my dad, especially her youngest brother, who was also abused, because one of the women my dad cheated with was his first wife. My grandma on my dad's side was deeply religious, never worked, and hated her husband so much that she hid money around the house in case she ever got the courage to leave. She never did. After my uncle went to prison, my grandpa became depressed, and she enabled him to essentially eat himself to death. The abusive uncle on my mom's side contracted hepatitis C and didn't tell his then-wife. She caught it, and after divorcing him, refused treatment and passed away around age 50. There's more, though less extreme. For example, my aunt on my dad's side used her husband to fund a dream lifestyle for their daughter, then divorced him right after they paid off her college debt. Another aunt cheated when she was younger, and her husband still struggles with trusting her. though they're the only couple in the family who haven't divorced. The two aunts also hate each other. One of them refuses to talk to their mother over a petty argument that happened while my grandfather was in assisted care. Right now, things are worse than ever. My mom's side is having a full-on breakdown over who will inherit what when my grandmother passes, even though her medical bills have drained almost everything. My abusive uncle is threatening my mom because she was appointed her guardian, and he's turning the youngest brother against her by saying she's stealing inheritance money. The truth is, there's barely anything left, and he refuses to move out of her house so it can be sold to pay for care. Story 23. When my dad was around 10 years old, he was searching through papers he found in his parents' closet. He discovered what he thought was his birth certificate, since it had his name on it, but then realized the birth date was wrong. His parents had lived in different states at that time, hadn't even met yet, and his mother would have only been around 13. He asked his parents about it, and they explained that his dad had been married before and had another son. My dad has a half-brother with the exact same name. There was no explanation for why my grandfather wasn't with his first wife or why he had no contact with his oldest child. No one ever told my dad's brothers. When he eventually shared the story with my mom and me, my mom said, "That explains so much. Your mom had me take out the mail when we were kids, and there was an envelope about child support." I wasn't going to say anything. I also discovered that my dad's great-great and great-great-great-grandfathers fought for the Confederacy and owned slaves. My dad is passionate about Union history. He's always reading and watching documentaries about it, so I've never told him. And really, who would want to know that their ancestors once owned people? Story 24. My dad's stepmom married my grandpa in 1968, about 18 months after his first wife passed away. His children, my dad and his sisters, were between 10 and 21 years old at the time. For all of us grandchildren, she was the only grandmother we ever knew. The first grandkids were born in 1969. We all knew she had been divorced before marrying my grandpa and that he was her second husband. She had one son from that first marriage. After 18 years of marriage, my grandpa passed away. After that, my grandma pretty much walked away from all of us. We would drive 5 hours to visit her while in town, and she would barely let us in the door. These weren't unannounced visits. We would plan weeks in advance and call ahead to let her know we were on our way. But in the 15 minutes it took to drive from my aunt's house to hers, she would suddenly make plans to go shopping with her sister or something similar, so she didn't have time to see us. As a teenager and later as a young adult, it really hurt. I loved her. She had always been grandma to me. When I was in my 30s, I lived just 5 minutes from her house. I tried several times to visit, but she was always busy, so eventually I gave up. 3 years ago, my dad's youngest sister, whose mother passed away when she was 8 and who had been raised by this grandma, posted on Facebook that our step-grandmother was in the ER with a possible heart attack. That's when it hit me. Wow, I forgot she was even still alive. I felt guilty that I had no emotion about her being sick or about the fact that I had no relationship with the last grandparent I had left. 18 months ago, my dad called to say she was in the hospital and likely wouldn't make it through the night. I felt guilty again, but also numb. She had walked away from being my grandmother years ago. She passed away the next morning, and it did hurt. I'd never have the chance to be her granddaughter again. But I still couldn't understand how someone could walk away from the children she helped raise, or the 13 grandchildren who only knew her as grandma. The day after she died, we all learned that my grandpa wasn't actually her second husband. He was her third. She had previously been married, had 4 sons, and was caught having an affair with her husband's friend, their neighbor. Her first husband divorced her and took the children. She married the man she had the affair with and had 1 son with him, the one we all knew. That second marriage was the one she spoke about. None of my grandfather's children knew she had 4 sons who lived in the same town she lived in with my grandfather. Her second son, our step-uncle, didn't even know about his 4 older brothers until after she passed. She never mentioned them, not even on her deathbed. The truth came out only because her sister helped write the obituary. I'm convinced my grandpa never knew about that first marriage or the children she left behind. Knowing how much he valued family, I believe he would have tried to reconnect her with them. And now I understand how it was so easy for her to walk away from us, because she'd already done it once before. Story 25. My father's parents died when he was 17. I had always been told they died in a car accident. I used to imagine how hard it must have been for him and his three siblings, thinking about him sitting at home, receiving the horrible news via phone call. I wish that was what really happened. One day when I was 10, I was having a snowball fight with my brother and our cousins, who are twins, the same age as us. Things got out of hand, and I remember my cousin Josh shouting something about our grandpa. I didn't understand him at first, so I asked him to clarify. That's when he said I was an idiot for thinking our grandparents had died in a car crash. In reality, our grandfather had taken the life of our grandmother in the kitchen, then taken his own life outside the house. My father, the oldest child, was the one who discovered them that day. I remember yelling, "That's not true, you're lying. Why would you say that?" We ended up getting into a huge fight. I just couldn't believe what I was hearing. The next day, my brother and I brought it up to our mom. She confirmed it was true. They had told us the story about the car accident to protect us. That day, I learned two things. My parents don't always tell the truth, how my grandparents really died. Story 26. Where to start? I've been in law enforcement for 10 years. During my first few years, in my early 20s, several federal investigators came to speak with me regarding a cold murder case that took place a few counties over. This particular case makes headlines every year around the anniversary of the person's disappearance, so it wasn't unusual to work with other agencies as new leads surfaced. During this specific meeting, the investigators shared some new information they were working with, including a more detailed location they wanted to search. As they spoke, I realized the exact search area was on the same property where I had grown up. I informed them that the location they were referring to was actually in the next county over. Then they mentioned the name of their suspect, and it was my father. My father, who had passed away 2 years earlier, had been divorced from my mother since I was in grade school. He had been a somewhat abusive alcoholic, which led to my mom leaving him. Unfortunately, the case is still unsolved, and I'll never have the chance to ask him what he knew or what he might have done. Story 27. For context, my mother was a dedicated, vocal, and active member of conservative Christian churches for most of her life, ranging from fundamentalist to mainstream circles. She raised me and my siblings in what's known as purity culture, a subculture focused on preventing any kind of sexual experience before marriage. She even had a part-time career as a Christian public speaker and published works that were sold in religious bookstores. In the past year, I discovered that the way my mother had touched me since I was 13 falls under the category of sexual molestation, described as covert or emotional incest. My father eventually admitted that he had known my mother had been unfaithful for decades, including with a missionary our family once hosted. He had wanted to divorce her, but believed that a broken home would be worse for us kids, so he kept quiet. My siblings later revealed the psychological abuse they had endured from her, severe enough to cause lasting trauma. Each of their revelations shocked the rest of us. As a result, all of us have cut off contact with her, and my father is currently preparing for divorce. She has since fled to another part of the country and is now staying with her own mother, who likely abused her as a child. It's highly likely that my mother has narcissistic or histrionic personality disorder, but she refuses to seek diagnosis or treatment, something not uncommon in these cases. I'm glad we all know the truth now, although I wish we had discovered it 30 or 40 years ago. We're all in therapy and doing better. I've left behind the faith I was raised in, the controlling views on sexuality, and the emotional conditioning that allowed abuse to go unchecked. Some people in the church world say I've changed completely. Others, mostly outside that world, say I'm the same person, just healthier now that I've started healing. Time will tell. Story 28. My grandfather was involved in some shady real estate dealings. The man he was partnered with, let's call him King, went on to build and own most of the downtown strip of our city during the 1970s. King became a multimillionaire and stayed that way for life. My grandfather was his vice president. At some point, my grandfather began having an affair with King's wife. They decided they were going to divorce their spouses and marry each other. The plan was for the money King's wife would receive in the divorce to be used to start my grandfather's rival real estate company. My grandfather even tried to absorb several of King's upcoming contracts by undercutting his bids. King caught my grandfather copying contract proposals in order to steal deals. In response, King beat him within an inch of his life. Not long after, King's wife mysteriously had a change of heart and decided not to go through with the divorce. My grandparents reconciled for a time, but ended up divorcing a few years later. After that, my grandfather spent the rest of his life bouncing between failed and borderline illegal business ventures. Now at 84, he spends his days drinking gin on his boat. Meanwhile, King still has buildings named after him across the city, and his family remains one of the wealthiest in town. Add a few missing persons cases, and you'd have the makings of a Coen Brothers film. Story 29. I never met my grandfather. He passed away long before I was born, but I've heard stories about him all my life. He spent his career as a police officer and was generally loved by everyone in town. As a testament to that, when he died, so many people sent flowers to the service that the two florists in town completely ran out. When I was younger, I was always told he died of a heart attack. But as I got older, I started hearing rumors that something much darker had happened. After years of wondering, I finally decided to look into it. Through research, I discovered that my grandfather didn't die of a heart attack. He had died by suicide. He hanged himself in the garage, and my grandmother found him the next morning. That alone was deeply shocking. But what made it even more painful was realizing that my grandmother still lives in that same house to this day. I can't imagine the kind of strength it must take to live with that kind of memory for over 40 years. Once I learned how he died, I wanted to understand why. What pushed him to take his own life? From what I found, my grandfather had worked a case that deeply affected him. It began when he got a call about a 10-year-old girl, around the same age my mother was at the time. She showed up at school one day, covered in bruises, which led her teacher to call the police. During the investigation, my grandfather discovered that the girl had been abused and assaulted by her uncle. He arrested the uncle and brought him to jail. Throughout the investigation and trial, my grandfather became close with the girl and her parents. They were devastated when the uncle was found not guilty on all charges. They told my grandfather they feared the worst, that he would come after the girl. My grandfather promised them that he would keep her safe. And from everything I've heard about him, he was a man who kept his promises. So when he received a frantic phone call from the girl's mother the following spring, saying her daughter had gone missing, it devastated him. He immediately feared the worst and threw himself into the search. He barely slept, stopped eating, and gradually began to unravel. He became short-tempered with my grandmother, distanced himself from colleagues and friends, and started neglecting both his work and family. As time passed and the case remained unsolved, his determination turned into obsession, then into anger. He was furious at the uncle, who continued to deny involvement despite strong suspicions. He was angry at the police department for not allocating more resources to the case. But most of all, he was angry at himself for not protecting the girl. That self-loathing led to depression. And one sleepless night, after months of torment, he quietly went into the garage, tied a noose, and ended his life. He left no note, no explanation, no goodbye. After his death, the case went cold. The little girl was never found, and all these years later, her disappearance remains unsolved. Story 30. My adopted uncle stopped coming to family events when I was around 4 years old. I remember him a little, but it always felt strange that he just disappeared, and no one ever talked about him. Years later, I learned the truth. He had been involved in a scam, and when a woman refused to take part in it, he killed her. He stabbed her over 40 times. He was sentenced to death, and that triggered a long legal process that I was never told about. Eventually, while on death row and not long before his scheduled execution, he died by suicide. I still remember that man. Not clearly, but I remember. One Christmas, just a few weeks before the murder, he showed us the beginning of a project he was working on. He had recreated scenes from the original Star Wars movie using action figures. As a kid who loved Star Wars, I was amazed. I thought it was the coolest thing ever. For years after, I would ask my parents when we'd see him again, and if he had finished the movie. It's crazy to think that someone who sat at our Christmas table, joking with us and making fun Star Wars videos, was capable of something like that. Story 31. Probably too late on this, but first off, this side of my family comes from old school West Virginia mountain folk. Anyway, my uncle's uncle, let's call him Tom, was dying of cancer. He told his wife, June, that she didn't have to stay home and live in his sorrow. He told her to go out and date, and said he'd even like to meet the man she'd end up spending the rest of her life with. No one in the family knew about this arrangement. Well, my Uncle Greg and his brother Steve eventually saw their Aunt June blatantly seeing another man while her husband was dying. One day, after watching her new partner, let's call him Harry, dropped June off, they decided to confront him. They waited on a back road and staged a breakdown. When Harry stopped to help, Greg and Steve ambushed him and beat him up badly. It escalated until Steve pulled out a gun and aimed it at Harry's head, ready to end his life. Greg stepped in, realizing he couldn't let that happen, and hit Harry with a bat instead. They left Harry there. He was in a coma for 2 weeks. During that time, the rest of the family found out about Tom's arrangement with June. When Harry finally woke up, he had no memory of what happened to him. He and June eventually got married and are still together. Greg and Harry now play cornhole together at family reunions. Harry will never know the truth. Story 32. It technically wasn't a secret, just something none of us knew about until recently. My granddad on my dad's side lived in Texas and only occasionally spoke with my dad. There had been a long-standing falling out between my grandma and granddad, and my grandma made my dad feel guilty for ever reaching out to him. She's complicated. About 2 or 3 years ago, when my dad and granddad hadn't spoken in a while, granddad got sick. We wouldn't have known, but 2 people reached out, his 2 oldest children, who were both in their 30s. We had no idea they even existed. Turns out my dad has 2 half-sisters, a half-brother, and a stepmother. The oldest half-sister has 3 kids of her own. When we picked up and drove to Texas to meet them, we were nervous. We were worried they might resent my dad for not keeping in better touch. But instead, they welcomed us like we'd known each other forever. When my dad returned to Texas a few weeks later, after our granddad passed, they opened their home to him again. It meant a lot. They were understanding about everything that had happened on my dad's side of the family. I miss them often and hope we can take another trip to visit them soon. Story 33. My extremely snobbish and self-righteous great-uncle fathered a child with a very wealthy, married woman. That child, my cousin once removed, was raised as her husband's son. The couple divorced soon after the child was born, and my great-uncle married the woman. However, he has never acknowledged the boy as his own. To everyone else, their relationship was presented as stepfather and stepson. When his wife died, my great-uncle inherited her entire fortune. Growing up, I always assumed my cousin was his biological child. They look almost identical. I couldn't believe it when I found out there was no official blood relation. Another cousin privately filled me in on the truth. Something everyone knew, but no one openly discussed. My great-uncle has always looked down on others who didn't live up to his strict standards. Knowing this scandal exists behind his polished image gives me a strange sense of satisfaction. His wealth came through inheritance, not success, and he has never acknowledged the son he fathered through an affair. It's a story worthy of a soap opera. Story 34. Back in the 1960s, my father worked at one of the labor camps on the West Coast. As you can imagine, racial tensions were high, and the police rarely responded to incidents in certain neighborhoods. One day after work, my dad and a friend were drinking and relaxing in an empty section of the orchards when a man approached them. The man was white and made aggressive remarks about them being in the area. I don't know exactly what was said, but it clearly wasn't anything polite. A fight broke out. The man tried to pull a small firearm, and my dad grabbed his friend's shotgun from the truck and shot him. They panicked and fled the scene, leaving the body there. Given the location, the authorities never responded. My grandmother revealed all of this to me on her deathbed. She was battling cancer and on pain medication, so I wasn't even sure if she realized what she was saying. I later brought it up to my mom, who confirmed it. She said everyone in the family knows, but they keep it buried. My dad was deeply affected by what happened and still thinks about it often. He's always been a great father and role model. Knowing this truth doesn't change how I see him, but it adds a layer of complexity I never expected. It's something I still struggle to fully process. Story 35. When I was about 12, I found a box full of old cards. Some were addressed to me, some to my sister or my mom, and some to our whole family. There were Christmas cards, Easter cards, birthday cards, and they were all signed Grandpa, except the ones to my mom, which were signed Dad. This completely confused me for 2 reasons. First, we had always received cards and gifts from my grandma and grandpa on holidays and birthdays. I didn't understand why there were separate cards from just my grandpa and why I never got them. Second, my maternal grandfather had passed away several years before some of the most recent cards had been dated. That's how I learned that my grandpa was actually my mom's stepdad. and that her biological father was still alive. When I asked about it, my dad told me that my mom didn't get along with him and told me not to bring it up. A few years later, the truth came out. He had been a heavy drinker and had serious issues with drugs and violence. He had physically abused my grandma, my mom, and her siblings. When my grandmother finally divorced him, she and the kids were kicked out of the church and left without support. My mom essentially raised her siblings while her mom worked multiple jobs. I had no idea about any of this. I had a fairly idyllic childhood. My mom was the picture of a hardworking, middle-class suburban mother. I just assumed her childhood had been as stable and loving as mine. Apparently, my biological grandfather had been trying to reconnect with her since around the time I was born. When I was 19 or 20, she finally gave in and re-established limited contact through phone calls and holiday cards. A few years ago, my job took me to the town where he lived, and I got the chance to meet him. The day we met was also his 20-year sobriety anniversary. He cried. I cried. My sister met him about a year later, too. He later sent me a card saying that meeting us was something he had prayed for over 2 decades. He wrote that I looked just like my mom and told us how proud he was of both her and us. He passed away about a year ago, but I still have the card and a photo of us together. So I guess my family secret has a bittersweet ending. Story 36. I was very close with my paternal grandfather. He passed away when I was in high school. My parents told me he died in his sleep from sudden heart failure. But even then, something didn't feel right. He'd been saying strange things in the years before he died, and I'd gone to my parents several times expressing concern. I told them I thought he might be struggling and could be suicidal. They brushed it off and told me, oh, he'd never do something like that. I begged them to get him a therapist or even have a pastor talk to him. Eventually, I let it go because I believed them. When he died, everything about it felt off. It was a closed casket service, which was strange for our family. We always have open casket funerals. When I asked about it, my parents gave weird, inconsistent answers. I remember my grandmother sobbing, saying things like, "Why'd he leave me here? Why didn't he take me with him?" That really stuck with me. I went to my parents and asked directly, "Did Grandpa take his own life?" They said no. They told me Grandma was just grieving and meant she wished she had died with him because she missed him. I asked them again and again. Each time they told me the same story. Eventually I believed it, because I had to. In the years that followed, Grandma continued to say disturbing things. She'd cry during certain movies and say, "I can't watch that. I've seen things. I've seen too much." She'd leave the room if anything violent or gory came on TV. I asked my parents again if they were telling the truth, and they insisted they were. 8 years passed. I never fully accepted the story, but I had no proof. Then one night, a family friend had too much to drink, and not realizing we didn't know, let it slip to my sister. My grandfather had taken his own life. He had died by gunshot. The friend had learned this from one of our cousins. My sister called me, sobbing. I didn't want to believe it, but suddenly all the strange pieces made sense. My sisters and I confronted our parents. They hung their heads and admitted it was true. My grandfather hadn't died peacefully in his sleep. He had died by suicide. My grandmother had found him in the basement. She'd heard the gunshot. My family is very traditional and old-world European, originally from Italy. They believe in protecting the women in the family, especially the younger ones. They think we can't handle difficult truths like the men supposedly can. That's why they lied to me. Even though I was the one who first expressed concern, I was the one who begged for him to get help. Finding out the truth so many years later felt like losing him all over again. I'm still not over it, even though it's been 15 years. What hurts most is that I knew something was wrong and no one listened. And when it happened, they still didn't tell me. They lied again and again. Story 37. My father's gambling habit. There were times when the mortgage wasn't getting paid, and we were eating off-brand macaroni 4 times a week. But my father always blamed our financial problems on my mother's irresponsible spending. As it turns out, my father was spending nearly every night at a sketchy dive bar that had slot machines, despite the fact that they were illegal in our state at the time. No one other than him was allowed to see the bills, so he could lie about our expenses and use creative accounting to hide the gambling losses. He claims he only lost a few thousand, but we all suspect the amount was much, much higher. Things were so tight financially that we only managed to get by because my grandparents were secretly giving my mom cash. The worst part, in my opinion, is that he wasn't even addicted to gambling. He quit cold turkey the moment my mom took over the finances. He's never shown the slightest interest in gambling since. I could have forgiven an actual addiction, but from what I can tell, he did it because he was bored and didn't care that his family was suffering. That was when I started losing faith in my parents. Story 38. Older people in my family are deeply manipulative. It all starts with my great-grandmother, or maybe just my grandmother. My grandmother is disabled, her legs don't work, and she's understandably very dependent on others. Thankfully, she has her own apartment now. But when she used to live with my great-grandmother, tensions would boil over. One time, my great-grandmother got so fed up, she doused my grandmother in alcohol and started flicking lighters near her. She's since been diagnosed with Alzheimer's and dementia, and with medication, she's doing better. Then there's my great-uncle. Let's call him Meal. He was abusive to his wives and was stealing money from my great-grandmother to buy himself luxury watches and expensive colognes. He eventually went to jail for one of those reasons. He just got out, along with my other great-uncle Jevin, who also spent time in jail. They were both gone since around 2012. Jevin was a heavy drinker and also stole money from our great-grandmother. Then there's my uncle, let's call him JK. JK was overweight, worked at a local grocery store, and somehow owned every video game console you can imagine. Nintendo 64, PS2, Sega, and even a custom gold PS4. How did he afford all of that on a grocery store salary? He was also stealing from my poor great-grandmother. At one point, my great-uncles were in jail, and my grandmother had moved far away. So it was just JK and my great-grandmother living in the house. You'd think JK would take care of her, especially since she hadn't bathed in a month and was clearly in need of help. But no, he was too busy draining her money. And now, instead of being held accountable, JK has an apartment in Hawaii. Yep, Hawaii, can you believe it? Out of everyone, only my mom and my aunt, who's been in medical school for 8 years, seem to have any decency. Story 39. I was hanging out with one of my cousins, drinking and just relaxing. I was in college at the time, and she was still in high school, so obviously we couldn't really be out too late together. Midnight rolled around and she needed to get home, but I wasn't sober enough to drive. We couldn't call anyone for help either, since our family had no idea we drank or smoked together, and we would have been in serious trouble if they found out. I asked her why her family was so strict about curfews, and that's when she said something that completely threw me off. She told me that a couple of our uncles had abused some of our younger nieces. Then she just stopped, like she realized she wasn't supposed to say it. She didn't go into detail or name names, and no matter how many questions I asked, she wouldn't say anything else. To this day, I'm still not sure if she made it up as an excuse to get home faster or if it really happened. But it got stuck in my head. Being from a large Mexican family, we have tons of uncles and nieces. I couldn't help but wonder who the alleged abusers and victims could be. She did reassure me that my father wasn't one of them, and that he didn't know about it either. She said if he knew, being the oldest sibling and the most level-headed one, he wouldn't have let something like that slide. Some time has passed and we don't hang out as much anymore. I still don't know what to believe. But whether it was true or not, that thought still comes to mind more often than I'd like to admit. Story 40. When I was 12 years old, my grandfather passed away. We cried, had a funeral, and the day after, my grandmother took me to our family store. She opened a hatch under the counter and pulled out 2 books. She said nothing, closed the store, and drove with me to a bank. She deposited one of the books at the bank and left. When we got home, she gave me the second book and told me to burn it. I asked why, and she simply said it was better not to ask. I was a good grandson, so I did as she asked. A few months later, she took me out to our cabin. She opened up a closet that had been locked for years and pulled out stack after stack of large bills. I sat in the car with them in my lap the whole way home. Again, I was told it was better not to know. Similar things happened occasionally over the next few months, then stopped. Fast forward 14 years. My grandmother was near death, and she gave me a small handwritten journal with addresses and passwords, and told me to take everything in it and give it to my mother. She also asked me to tell my mom that she was sorry for lying all those years. After my grandmother passed, I followed her instructions. The book my grandmother had hidden was a ledger in a second set of books from our family's business and from my grandfather's business. As it turned out, my grandfather had secretly been collecting money for the mafia years ago.